Walter Isaacson joins me live in Studio Q. Welcome.
Hey, Brent, it's good to be back in Studio Q.
Good to have you back with us. This is how Bill Gates describes an innovator. He says, an innovator is probably a fanatic, loves what they do, works day and night, may ignore normal things to a degree, and therefore be viewed as a bit unbalanced. He's talking about himself there, and he's just one of hundreds of innovators that you profile in this book. But what qualities would you add to the description of innovator that we just heard from Bill Gates?
Rebel. You got to think different, as Steve Jobs said, and that's what Bill Gates did. That's what Mark Zuckerberg did. That's what, the people who did Google, Larry and Sergey, and certainly Steve Jobs. That ability to question received wisdom. When the first hobbyist computer arrives at the Homebrew Computer Club in like 1974, it's something you have to solder together as a kid. It made everybody think, what could I do with my own home computer? And you have Bill Gates and Paul Allen creating BASIC. They want to do the software for it. Right. And you have Wozniak saying, hey, wait, with that Intel microprocessor, here's how to do it and connect a monitor. And he's giving it away, all the specs at the Homebrew Computer Club. And his friend from down the street, Steve Jobs, says, hey, let's go to my parents' garage and we can make these things and sell them. So just out of like one meeting of the Homebrew Computer Club, you get a group of people thinking different. You get Apple, you get Microsoft.
That was like a nuclear fission reaction when that computer came out.
I would love to have been there for that.
It set so many people off in so many different directions, and nearly all of them followed a path that led somewhere. But let's start at the very beginning of this book, because you just said rebel was the important quality that these innovators needed to have. Was Ada Lovelace a rebel? You start the book in the 19th century with her.
Ada Lovelace is, of course, a rebel because she's a woman doing mathematics and publishing in scientific journals and trying to understand computers in the 1830s. Tell me, that's pretty rebellious back then. Women didn't generally do that back then. And she really is a role model for women today. She was Lord Byron's daughter, and so she had a poetic streak, but her mother wanted to make sure she didn't end up like Lord Byron, who was a bit of a too romantic of a streak, I would say. So has her tutored in mathematics mainly, as if that's going to be some antidote to having a poetic streak. With Ada Lovelace, you get what she calls poetic science, this ability to connect the humanities to science. So she looks, for example, at punch cards that are telling the looms how to do beautiful patterns. And she says those punch cards could tell a computer, a calculating machine, how to do words and music. And she even writes a algorithm, basically the first software program. So she is a great pioneer in the 1840s.
A lot of people credit her with writing that first program for analytical machines, but you seem more impressed by another idea that she had. She saw the potential for computers in our daily lives. That seems to be the revolutionary idea that you credit her with.
The idea of making our computers more intimate, more personal, more connected with us. She said machines will never think. It'll be up to us to do the creativity. So let's get our machines intimately connected to us. The opposite strand was Alan Turing, who came along 100 years later in the 1930s and 40s and called this Lady Lovelace's objection, that machines would never think. There's a great new movie coming out called The Imitation Game with Benedict Cumberbatch playing Turing, and it sort of shows that tension about, are machines fundamentally different from humans? At first, Turing didn't think so. But in some ways, by the end of that movie, you'll see he comes around to the Ada way of thinking.
This tension and this frisson between ideas and movements, there's the synthesis between art and technology that Ada Lovelace brought, but then it's expressed over and over again on this journey, whether it's through the teams of people, the competing systems that were developed, activist versus capitalist, top-down authoritarian versus open source. It's the reason why the answer to the question of who invented the computer is so vexing. The 1930s and the 1940s were really the time when the first computer breakthroughs were happening. In your opinion, who would you credit with building the first computer?
I would say it's the team at the University of Pennsylvania who do ENIAC, because their computer is programmable, all electronic. It has multiple purposes. It's not specific purpose. Obviously, you have Turing at Bletchley doing Colossus, but that's mainly to break German wartime code, so it can't be reprogrammed. The amazing thing about the programming of ENIAC is that it was done by 6 women who were PhDs in math. Women back then were great mathematicians in the 30s and 40s. And the men, sort of the boys with their toys like us, thought the hardware was a really important thing. So they think it's sort of clerical work, how you program the hardware. It, of course, turns out that the operating system programming is much more important than the hardware, which becomes sort of a commodity.
That was the genius of Bill Gates. He figured that out.
He
maybe
figured
before
that out,
anybody
but
else.
the women programmers of ENIAC did it first, about 20 years earlier.
1969 was a tumultuous year in American history. It's the year that humans landed on the moon. But 2 events, you argue, were of more significance, and they're relatively unheralded. One is the invention of the microchip. The other happened on October 29th in UCLA. What was it?
That's when they first connect the nodes, what they then call the ARPANET, but eventually is woven into the internet. And it's amazing during that period, because that's just when I can first remember, things in history. I was, in my early teens, and you remember the moon landing, but if they do the microchip and connecting the internet on that same day, neither of them make headlines, but the people who made them were just as cool as the astronauts who did the original moon trips, and they never got headlines, but they affected our lives, I think, more.
So what was that first message when computers first talked to computers at that time? What was the first message that they transmitted?
There was a really cool guy named Charlie Klein. I've seen him a couple times in the past few weeks because he's been coming to my book events. He was just somebody at the UCLA lab of Len Kleinrock, and so he decided to log on to the computer up in Palo Alto to see if he could test this out.
Right.
He types an L and the L goes through. He types an O and the O goes through for log on. Then he types and the thing crashes. And so the first message was just LO. And in some ways, I think that's kind of cool. Lo and behold, we now have an internet.
Yeah, it sounds like Genesis. It sounds like the word from
It was
Genesis.
better than one small step for whatever. It's just low.
So this is the early prototype of the internet, the ARPANET, and it was funded by the military. It was created by academics. It was military people and business people. They were all involved. And the greatest innovation that came out of this idea was the idea that information would move through decentralized networks using regional hubs in small packets. That sounds nerdy, but it's huge.
It's nerdy,
Why?
but it is totally huge because nobody gets to control it. The Pentagon is building this, and they want to have a system that will survive a nuclear attack if the Russians attack us. So they want no centralized hub. They want every node of the internet to have, but the graduate students who were building it, most of them in the early 70s, they were avoiding the Vietnam War. But they just wanted to make sure that the Pentagon, the power structure and all that didn't have control of the computer. So you have these 2 different mindsets, both building the internet. And as it is, there is nobody who, when I was first doing digital media for Time magazine, my boss kept saying, who controls the internet? Who owns it? And I kept trying to explain nobody. And to understand that, you have to understand the really cool people who built it.
But there's still a debate out there. Was the internet created to save or to serve the world in the event of a nuclear attack?
Right.
And you give 2 answers to that. They're yes and no.
Exactly.
The debate continues.
The people at the Pentagon were funding it to survive a nuclear attack. The people who were building it thought it was decentralized to make sure nobody was in control. There's a guy named Steve Crocker who I love because he's the one who really did the protocols for the first ARPANET things, and his boss, Stephen Lukasic, got into a debate. Lukasic was the guy who was actually running the program at the Pentagon, and he says to Steve Crocker, yeah, we were doing it to survive a nuclear attack. You were on the bottom, but I was on top, so you didn't know. To which Crocker says, no, I was on the bottom and you were on top, so you didn't know. So in some ways, the answer is both.
There's this tension between Antiauthority, the ARPANET guys that were working on it, and the kind of more a kind of a system that was dictated in more of a military system. But when you write about the development of the personal computers, you start with the hippies. You start with the real anti-authority people.
These are the people who want to take machine power away from that Orwellian notion that the Pentagon, the power structure, the corporations, and the establishments will control our machines. And indeed, that's the way it was when computers were big and yeah, expensive. You know, you couldn't just own one for yourself. But there was this hunger among hippies, the hackers,
The hobbyists that you mentioned?
the hobbyists, you know, who love like me. I grew up making ham radios in my basement and soldering circuits. But also the sort of community organizers. All of these people in the Bay Area of California have this sort of cultural brew, some of them living on communes, some reading the Whole Earth Catalog once too often. They all want, as the Whole Earth Catalog put it, access to tools. So what do? They start seeing these microprocessors that Intel is doing, and it gets to the Homebrew Computer Club that we mentioned earlier, where everybody's saying, hey, I want to be able to make one for me. I don't want it all the computing power to be owned by the man or the establishment.
The Whole Earth Catalog was also a kind of do-it-yourself fusion of commercial and self-help information. But the first real commercial home computer was aimed at hobbyists, and you received it in pieces in a box and assembled it yourself. What can you tell us about the Altair?
The Altair was done by the ultimate hobbyist guy, a guy I love in my book, and named Ed Roberts. And, you know, he was building outdoor rocket ships and tracers for all true geeks. I mean, these, you know, 15-year-old boys who wanted to build things in their backyard. And, of course, he keeps failing. This is the first great serial entrepreneur. He finally makes a calculator you can build at home. Well, it ends up being more expensive than the one you can buy from made in Japan. So he risks all of his money and decides he is going to make a computer. And they bring it up to the Homebrew Computer store. It gets on the cover of Popular Electronics. And as I said earlier, Bill Gates and Paul Allen grabbed that copy of Popular Electronics. So do I. You know, in late 1973, you see it on the cover. You say, I want one. And obviously, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs look at it when it first comes to the Homebrew Computer Club. And soon everybody is making their own personal computers. And in a way, it's separate from the internet. People just want them for their own little creativity devices. What really causes the digital revolution to happen is when the home computer and the internet start connecting.
But that home computer, the Altair also was a challenge to all of these people because it was so unfinished. It was so
horrible.
Yeah,
it was a joke. I mean, all the people that are like Lee Felsenstein and Woz at the Homebrew Computer, it has like 20 lights up front, and that's all it does. It doesn't have a monitor. You have to enter things using little toggle switches, and then maybe you can add things. Like Steve Dompier at the first Homebrew meeting figured out how to make songs simply because it, you know, interfered with radio signals sometimes. But you couldn't do anything with it. But everybody figures out, with that microprocessor that Intel had come out with, I can make it better. And of course, one of the guys at Intel is named Gordon Moore, and he has just predicted that the power of the microprocessor will double every 18 months. So people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, they can see the future suddenly. They say, hey, I can make this much more complicated because in 18 months we'll have the power to do it.
So the Altair sent Jobs and Wozniak off in the direction of what? Creating a kind of hardware, and it sent Bill Gates off in the direction of I want to write code for this. I want to write software for this thing.
Yeah, and it also sort of has the first tension between open source versus proprietary, because a couple things happen. First of all, Woz makes his, computer and wants to give it away. He's kind of part of that homebrew hacker mentality, share it. And it's Steve Jobs who says, no, let's go to my parents' basement and let's make these things and sell them. So you have that tension between commercializing things and doing it for the hacker fun of it. Likewise, Bill Gates creates Microsoft Basic in order to run the machine. When they show it off at the Homebrew Computer Club, people steal the tape, the paper tape, make 70 copies of it because they believe software should be free. And you know what? I think that tension, everybody says, who's right? Should it be free? Should it be proprietary? Well, it's a tension. Some people doing it for money, some people trying to hack it and do it for free, that allows the creativity. But thank God for the hackers, because it really does push the envelope.
Well, Gates wrote what must be the first letter warning software copyright pirates to lay off distributing his code.
Exactly,
and was abused
letter.
for that. The portrait of Bill Gates is fascinating in this book because he's nerdy and egotistical and irascible, but he's a visionary. And he knew that he was a visionary. He said at 16 that he would be a millionaire before he was 30.
He was totally wrong. He had $100 million before he was 30. He was much more successful than he thought. He had a combination of being driven, having a really good business sense, being ambitious, and being, I mean, not everybody in this book is a genius, but he was. He was awesomely smart. I mean, I'd watch him sometimes. He'd have 4 computer screens. He'd be coding with one hand, answering email with the other. And he was really one of the great coders. I mean, he could write software programs and do it in a very tight and elegant way. So he takes over from his friend Paul Allen and others and drives Microsoft, drives everybody nuts. So does Steve Jobs. They're both people who can drive people to distraction, but they also drive them to do amazing feats that they didn't know they'd be able to do.
There's a story about Gates in the book where he is always trying to change the level of ownership that he has over the profits in the company, and so he's always trying to adjust the agreement that he has with his partners.
Paul Allen, yeah.
Paul Allen was furious about that, and in Apple it was Wozniak who went to Steve Jobs and said, "Wait, I deserve more of this company than you." What happened when Wozniak made that argument in the very early days of Apple?
Well, Steve Jobs said it should be 50-50. Steve was very emotional, and he cried. He said to Woz and to Woz's father, Jerry Wozniak, look, if you don't want to do it 50-50 and equally, just count me out. And in some ways, he was right. And he was kind. I mean, people don't often use the word kind for Steve Jobs. But Woz, who I love dearly, and he's still a wonderful guy, wasn't really driving the growth of Apple. It was Steve Jobs who did it after, 1978, 79, 80, into that Macintosh period. And yet Steve Jobs always kept Woz as a partner, even though Jobs was more important. Bill Gates, likewise, was driving Microsoft, much more important than Paul Allen after the first few years. But Bill Gates didn't say, let's just keep it 50-50. He changed it to 2/3, 1/3. Totally justifiable. But you have to have a strong business sense, just the type of business sense that allows them to outmaneuver IBM to want to outmaneuver your friend Paul Allen.
Gates and Jobs are just two of the many innovators that we meet here. But between the Microsoft camp and the Apple camp, which was the first to understand that the web was going to be the thing, that the killer app for the home computer?
Well, actually, neither. I mean, both Apple and Microsoft miss the internet and networking and social networking, and still in some ways have. I mean, I think that the good thing about the digital revolution is things keep getting disrupted. So you have somebody like Tim Berners-Lee sitting at an atom smasher in Switzerland working, and he decides he wants to do a way of leaping around the internet where you can sort of make little links using hypertext that Ted Nelson had invented. And indeed, he creates the World Wide Web. That was not created by Apple or by Microsoft, nor were the first web browsers created. So the good thing about the revolution is Steve Jobs is good at cannibalizing his old stuff, saying we got to cannibalize the iPod to make the iPhone. But most companies aren't. And that's why you see Larry Page and Sergey doing Google, or people doing Netscape and the World Wide Web, or Wikipedia. All of these are not done by the major companies, especially Microsoft.
Ada Lovelace said computers will never understand. She said that the analytical machine has no pretension to originate anything, and many still believe that's true. Alan Turing's test, his challenge still stands. So looking at 35 years of artificial intelligence research, do you think a computer's ability to learn will always be limited?
Yes, and that'll be somewhat of a controversial statement. I certainly believed otherwise when I started researching this book. But I read every story in the 1950s that said in 20 years, computers will be able to learn. The perceptron is just like the human brain. And every story in the 60s that said that. And it's always a mirage. It's always 20 years away, the strong artificial intelligence or the singularity. And in some ways, our minds are so different in the way they work and the way they're creative than computers, that maybe instead of pursuing artificial intelligence, we should do what Ada suggested, or what Larry Page and Sergey Brin did, or Jimmy Wales when he does Wikipedia, is combine human imagination with the processing power of computers. That's what's been successful, as opposed to the quest for strong artificial intelligence.
So you're saying symbiosis is the thing.
Partnership and symbiosis. And, there's a whole stream of people in my book, unbelievably colorful and interesting. I hope people get into them, who aren't quite as famous. They're people like Vannevar Bush, who said, hey, we're going to have symbiosis with our machines. Licklider, J.C.R. Licklider, this Missouri dude who said, we're going to have a partnership with machines, and he invents an air defense system and is the original funder of the internet when he goes to the Pentagon. All the way through Doug Engelbart, Alan Kay, and then finally Steve Jobs. And that's why we're going to wear computers on our wrists. We have them on our eyeglasses. We have them in our pocket, because we're getting closer and more intimate, not because we're trying to create machines that think without us.
And it's amazing how many of the people that you just named also have that background of science and the arts, of technology and humanities, and how important that is. And that's another theme that runs through this book, beginning with Ada Lovelace.
And it really is a theme of Studio Q. Every time I've listened, every time I've been on, you connect the arts and technologies just like most people of this new generation do. And it's partly, if you remember, every time Steve Jobs launched a product, he'd end the show with the intersection of two streets, the liberal arts and the sciences. He said, if you stand there, that's where the creativity occurs. If you're a poet and a mathematician like Ada Lovelace was, you can see that coding and programming and a mathematical equation is something you visualize, just as you could visualize a line of her dad's poetry, like she walks in beauty like the night. And that notion of standing in that, especially in the coming age, because in this next phase of the digital revolution, it will truly belong not just to the engineers, but the people who connect the creative industries, the Studio Qs, with the technology.
Walter Isaacson. The new book is called The Innovators, How a Group of Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created the Digital Revolution. It's published by Simon & Schuster. It's in stores now. Walter Isaacson, thank you for being with us live in Studio Q.
Hey, thanks for having me back. Hope to see you soon.